invited to host a conversation, which is one of the segments of a doctoral colloquium. And Steve Sandage and I had a conversation in September under the same topic, trauma and forgiveness, and we hosted a group of alumni from BU School of Theology, and it was a pretty exciting conversation in terms of talking about topics that have a lot of weight for people for different reasons, and we decided that conversation might be good to have again, but differently inflected. So I thought we would talk a little bit about how we approach the topics that we do from our disciplines, why we came to do work on, in my case, trauma, and in Steve's forgiveness, although we touch on both. But so why the topic at all? So that's the first. Talk a little bit about what that looks like in our research. But then we thought we'd talk a little bit more about methodology. And we thought this would be helpful for doctoral students who are working on topics and trying to figure out how is it that I'm going to approach the topics that interest me, who are going to be my conversation partners, how do I make those decisions, and also many of the people in track 3 do interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary work. And what does that really mean, and when do disciplines come into a fruitful engagement, and when are they not really talking to each other? And we thought that conversation about methodology would be helpful for students who are working on that in terms of their own research. And then we thought we'd open it up to questions from you and see what emerges. We were rather organic in how we did this last time, so when you try to repeat anything that you did before, there's always the fear that whatever energy you had will not come back, but we're hoping. And Chris is our moderator, so he'll tell us if we're starting to lose the attention of the room, things like that.
Well,
Right,
sounds
Chris?
like you're anticipating trauma and seeking forgiveness.
Well, so I'll start with my interest in trauma and forgiveness. My research is mostly on the forgiveness side of that, although as a clinician, I work with folks who have experienced trauma and also folks that are very interested in forgiveness. My research touches on both. I guess I first got interested in forgiveness coming out of seminary, starting in graduate school in psychology, and was looking for a thesis topic. And to pick premarital counseling because my wife and I were engaged during that first semester. And then we got married over the Christmas break, and I promptly switched my topic to forgiveness. I was no longer interested in premarital counseling and somehow forgiveness, but in particular seeking forgiveness from others was on my mind, and that became my thesis topic. And since it's shifted a bit more as the field of psychology has towards the questions of what does it mean to actually forgive others, what's involved in forgiving others, what impedes forgiving others. That's where the focus has been in psychology, although there's research on forgiving the self and seeking forgiveness from others. And when I did my thesis in the early 90s, it was there were about 24 studies, empirical studies of forgiveness in psychology. And there's now in these 20-some years, probably over 2,000 scientific studies of forgiveness in psychology. So it's obviously taken off as a huge topic of interest. It's actually become a mainstream topic in psychology, which still kind of blows my mind to some extent. I'll be doing a continuing ed workshop on forgiveness in psychotherapy at the American Psychological Association convention this summer, which I really can hardly believe that topic is going to make it into that sort of mainstream setting. Now, having said that, in psychology is really primarily an empirical descriptive discipline. We'll problematize that a little bit. but it attempts to be descriptive in trying to understand how do things unfold, what are the causal mechanisms, less about what should be the ideal of human functioning, and more what is, what's going on. Psychologists kind of can get wary about the idea of theology coming in, unless they're people who happen to like theology like I do, for a couple reasons. They can get nervous that ideals are going to impinge on the quality of the science, which I don't think is a great argument, but I understand it. And then also the reality that some psychologists might be afraid that if you're advocating for a particular theological frame, then how will that apply to various other people? It's kind of a diversity type of question, especially in clinical practice, where we end up working with people of a lot of different traditions. Nevertheless, I would say in the growing of the field, there's now been more and more interest in religiosity, spirituality, and even theology, and the particularity of people's traditions and commitments that way. So that's been exciting to see develop. And from the psychology side, around forgiveness in particular, there's a few main areas that I'm working in, and these will help me describe the field a little bit. One is, what are the dynamics involved psychologically when people forgive? Personality-wise, developmentally, and so one area I do research is on relational development, attachment, empathy, differentiation, which helps to begin to try to account for individual differences would be one of the major psych terms. What's the difference between David and myself in how our psychological constitution might impact our differing struggles and possibilities for forgetting others? So in other words, it's an individual differences kind of approach. So I do research in that area. Another major area is forgiveness interventions, counseling, other kinds of interventions, which is a change or transformation type of question. When people go through some process that actually moves them towards forgiving others, what are the outcomes of that? And it turns out there are difficult problem cases around forgiveness. Do we forgive perpetrators? What about abuse? What about severe trauma? Those are often the questions that people find the most interesting. In the day-to-day work I do as a clinician doing mostly couples and family therapy, a lot of the forgiveness questions are not that exciting. They're kind of ordinary day-to-day of people that want to be in ongoing relationships, and it's pretty challenging to have ongoing relationships as a couple and family life and friendship and church community if you don't practice forgiveness at all. And there's now a ton of data showing that forgiveness in general is correlated with lots of indices of mental and physical health. It would probably be better to take up smoking and become more forgiving than to not smoke and be chronically unforgiving, just in terms of the health data. So that gets people's interest too, sometimes who weren't previously interested in the topic. So there's research going on in terms of interventions and processes of change. We just completed a clinical trial of forgiveness and justice skills in the treatment of borderline personality disorder, which is a generally heavily traumatized clinical condition, so I can say a little bit more about that. But there's over 50 clinical trials of forgiveness interventions, and they're progressively moving into more difficult kinds of cases, which heightens the complexity quite a bit. Another area that is developed in the field is a lot of attention to intercultural and other kinds of social diversity differences in forgiveness. That's the area I do work. That field has really exploded, I would say, in the last 8 to 10 years, where there's empirical forgiveness studies going on around the world in really every continent, in lots of different cultural perspectives, to try to tease out how does culture factor in to differences in how people think about forgiveness, practice forgiveness. So that's another major area. And then finally, I'll mention forgiveness and spirituality is another area where I do empirical research, and that area has really grown. And the questions there have to do with not does spirituality help people forgive or not? It is more nuanced than that. What are the differing ways of relating to the sacred? And these can be characterized in various ways. Images of God, implicit relational templates about God or the sacred, practices within various traditions. What are the ways of relating to the sacred that are conducive to forgiving others? And what are the ways of relating to the sacred that are contradictory? Because one of the interesting things in the empirical psychology of spirituality and religion is that, and most of us who've been in religious communities know this, you can go into any religious community, right? And you can find some people who somehow their faith or their spirituality is really helping them be a forgiving person. And they might be sitting next to someone who's in the same religious or spiritual community who somehow their faith, their implicit spirituality is making them a more ornery, antagonistic, bitter person. And the empirical story that's playing out now shows that, yeah, there's differing ways of relating to the sacred, and they have differing outcomes in terms of moving people towards becoming more or less forgiving.
Great. So I'm going to say a little bit about what brought me to the topic of trauma, and then why forgiveness was never a topic on the table for me while I was studying trauma. So why, you said the F word, I think you said that last time, that why the concept of forgiveness is so problematic in many ways when you're talking about trauma. And so I'll kind of end with that. As a theologian, as somebody who is studying systematic theology, the question of suffering, Christology, the cross, atonement, were natural places of interest to me, and as Jonathan knows, that a lot of that came from my literary interests. I was always interested in novels. I was interested in the question of suffering, and Dostoevsky, Why Do the Innocent Suffer? So you could say that my interest in trauma actually started through my study of literature, and then emerged as the deep theological questions that arose from literature moved me then to study trauma theologically, and I usually narrate it by talking about the impact of my graduate studies at Yale, which I thought I was going to study trauma and the cross, because the cross is the symbol that you go to as a Christian theologian to think about how to articulate suffering, the problem of suffering. And Yale at the time was a very interesting place to study trauma and post-Holocaust studies. And when I was taking classes at Yale Divinity School, I would walk down the hill. Any of you know New Haven, it's a hill. You walk down the hill, and I would go to the Yale Psychiatric Institute, and I would listen to clinicians who were talking about their work with second-generation Holocaust survivors. And the phenomenon that they were describing to me was something very different than Christian theology had contended with, which is, how is it that parents who have never talked about their experience of being in concentration camps or have somehow transmitted the symptoms of trauma to their children who have never actually heard the story of their parents' experience. So there's some phenomenon happening where there's no telling of a story, but in fact the children are manifesting symptoms of, in many cases, nightmares of not their own trauma, but something related to their parents' trauma. That to me was like unbelievably a phenomenon that I thought, oh, this is really interesting. There's some transmission of traumatic histories that are being registered within those children, but non-narratively. There's no story told. And that really was and continues to be a focus of a lot of work with Holocaust survivors and their children, is to figure out what exactly is this transmission. So I would listen to clinicians, and I had no training in how to read clinical discourse, but I thought, oh, Christian theology has not dealt with this. So I trudged back up the hill, and I started reading studies in trauma, clinical, but also at the time, this became interesting in the Yale English department. So you think, like, why are people interested in trauma in the Yale English department? There was a connection between post-Holocaust studies in a clinical vein and Yale School of American Deconstruction and literary theory. So literary theorists were interested in the kind of gaps and fissures within literature and the kind of reception of reading and the transmission of how we read and interpret texts and what is not said, a kind of Derridian literary theory, and this clinical work. And they were actually talking to each other at Yale. They're saying there's something in the way textually that's transmitted that connects literary theory and this phenomenon in the clinical field. And so for me, it meant that I didn't really have to trade in my literary interests for it and somehow become a psychology major, but that there was a way in which the transmission, the reading of text in the Christian tradition is not just a simple transmission of what an author says, but in fact you're reading for something that may not be said. And that has something to do with reading to get at dimensions of human experience that can't be narrated. So there's a kind of enigmatic way of reading theology that I wanted to figure out more about, and that sent me, I think, into this field of trauma studies, which I see as radically interdisciplinary. It has, in many cases, moved off the psychoanalytic couch. A lot of the people who do trauma studies will recognize kind of Freud's early theories of the death drive, his own observations of combat veterans, traumatic flashbacks, the kind of father of the diagnosing this phenomenon that we call trauma. A lot of people trace it to Freud, but I think what's interesting is that it moved into a much broader disciplinary inquiry about, for instance, in history, how do we interpret the effects of wars that were never completely ended, but that somehow continue and manifest in current violence. We could think of the history of slavery in a similar way, or post-colonial histories. What does it mean that histories that were never really brought into consciousness or worked through in kind of clinical terms, that they somehow re-haunt in the present? And that to me is not just a question of psychology or an individual clinical relationship, but a way of reading history, a way of reading literature, a way of reading, and for me, a way of reading theology. So I see kind of post-colonial studies, certain strains of it is just very clearly related to trauma studies. They're race theory. A lot of the critical theories are not named as trauma theory, but they share a lot in terms of trying to figure out not the conscious dimensions of existence, but the dimensions of existence that never emerge into language, into a kind of cognitive domain. And so that takes a certain hermeneutic. that was for me of the way that I read theological texts is I'm trying to read for these dimensions that aren't so obvious.
Mhm.
And there's other people who read in this way too, so they're kind of my
Clinicians,
people.
for example. I just-
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, it's like you're reading symptoms. You're
Yeah.
interpreting.
Right.
And so I think for me it's hard for me to talk a often clear methodology, because some of it, and I'm just gonna put it out, may not be helpful for doctoral students at all. There's a kind of intuitive way of reading to say, whatever is said, there's a lot not said. And somehow the not said is operating on the said. And there are certain populations who just get that, and I would say it's tied to oppression, of people who've had histories suppressed, people who things look a certain way on the surface, but then there's all this other stuff operating, and that all the other stuff operating, there's a silencing. There's people who don't want those histories told. So that brings into view power, the way that power functions, who tells the story, who writes the story, whose story isn't being told. These are all questions that are questions that are at the heart of feminist theology, liberation theology. It's not new. So it's not like feminist theologians have never talked about this stuff before. It's a different angle into some of the, I think, questions of how does power function, and what are dominant Christian discourses and not others. So I think that's probably, I haven't quite articulated things in that way before, but I guess I could say about why forgiveness has been problematic.
Sure, yeah.
So I was asked to be filmed for a documentary on forgiveness, and I really, really struggled, and I did probably the worst interview on this. I don't know. I got completely cut from the documentary. Like, Rodney Peterson is all over this documentary, and I think it was because I really hadn't thought about forgiveness doing trauma, and you might think that's kind of embarrassing. But then I thought about it some more, and I think one of the things is forgiveness in many cases comes with a mandate to forgive. And I think the feminist instincts in me about the asymmetry of power and the position that forgiveness sometimes puts people in makes them more vulnerable to being hurt rather than empowered. So I want to ask, under what are the conditions in place that forgiveness can be a healing, empowering experience for persons who've been severely harmed? And so I think a lot of my aversion to forgiveness came from my feminist instincts about who's setting the terms for like how this is going to happen, and the kind of I would say religious mandate to forgive, and which has set me on some pretty interesting biblical interpretation of when the resurrected Jesus returns, and it's like, how does forgiveness fit into the Pentecost story, or for instance, like, and I keep coming back to the question, to the observation that when he first appears to the disciples who are afraid and in lockdown, the first thing he says is peace, and then the kind of words about forgiveness come later. And that to me has become really, really important, is that answers the questions of conditions. And that unless peace or safety is established, that forgiveness is going to be a problematic concept. So the burden, I think the burden placed on the victim or the one who's been harmed, those are some of my, I wish I could have articulated some of that for the documentary, but but I've always been nervous about a lot of the people who work on forgiveness, this is not, why are there a lot of men working on forgiveness? So theologically, like, if you notice, the people who work on forgiveness, or it's often about public, like people are interested in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, they're interested in kind of big events of forgiveness, and we could talk about that, a kind of public spectacle, kind of like how effective that was. We could talk about that, but I was just never interested in working with the people who are working on forgiveness until now. But I think that's telling, is that who's interested in the conversation. So when you look around and you say, well, who's talking about forgiveness, and why are they interested, and they weren't really I was nervous about the conversation, partly because of what were the baseline assumptions that people were making about forgiveness from the very start of the conversation.
Could play off of that for a couple things. Fascinating stuff. Sharon Lamb at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, has been one of the psychological voices who's raised a lot of these questions from a feminist sociocultural perspective. She co-authored a book in the early 90s, Before Forgiving, something like cautionary notes, and there was a lot of this empirical research developing, and she and some others raised these feminist domestic violence, oppression questions, I think rather insightfully. And within psychology, those are pretty well understood now as the key things, you know. It's part of the reason I've moved towards talking about forgiveness and justice being a dialectic that are challenging to navigate and balance in life, but that they're both important. Human systems at the individual or family or sociocultural level are challenged. How do we somehow work with both forgiveness and justice? Some of the great social theorists, and I think social justice theologians, King and people today like Thich Nhat Hanh, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, frame forgiveness and justice as implicitly as a dialectic that have to be balanced. And psychologists in general, though not all, are going to be very wary about kind of coercive forgiveness, which this is a touch point with theology, you know, that the crucifixion in Christian theology would have to be viewed as traumatic. And some theologies idealize that in a way that is combined with a coercion about forgiveness that certainly silences victims in many situations. Curiously, I've had clients like that. The client that you were quoting, I guess I told that story sometimes as a client at the first session I worked with her. She was from a very conservative Christian community. In the first session, she told me, don't ever use the F word with me. And then she kind of smiled at me with a sort of a traumatized look in her eye, I would say. And I said naively, what F word? And I was thinking of one in particular, and she said, forgiveness. Don't ever use the word forgiveness with me. She was the daughter of an itinerant preacher that beat the hell out of her and would quote Bible verses afterwards, literally. You hear stories about this sometimes, but I've seen a couple cases that were that direct. So that was the coercive, traumatizing kind of forgiveness. And I think that's part of the reason we need really good interdisciplinary, integrative theological work around these difficult issues, you know, to resist that. I've had clients who were told by well-intentioned people they weren't to forgive people. Almost coercion the other way, as though you can't forgive. And I think that when we start to use any power to coerce people in various ways, it's problematic. One of the other interesting connections is that trauma will often make it difficult for people, not always, but many times, to forgive anybody. So the clients that I was talking about who meet criteria for borderline personality disorder, one of the things that's interesting there is we could ask, well, are they going to forgive the perpetrators in their life? Again, as I said before, that's a back burner question that I don't find usually is all that important to what I'm doing. But this clinical condition leads to burning through relationship after relationship, where you could say their brains are so traumatized that they have trouble managing their emotional dysregulation and anger in any relationship. And the number one prognostic factor for borderline personality disorder over time is the ability to sustain at least one safe relationship in your life. So I actually, around my forgiveness interests, am mostly concerned about kind of the secondary trauma effects that make it challenging for people to work through conflict and sustain the relationships they might like to have in their life. But they just have such difficulty managing dysregulation when it comes online. One client that I worked with who was like that, I always change some of the features, but he would go into a store, and if the restaurant service was off a little bit, like the portion size was not quite what he thought he should get, he might stand up and start screaming at people in the restaurant. And his wife didn't like being around that anymore. Most of his friends didn't like being around that anymore. Over the years, he became a very lonely, isolated person. And I think I came to see that he had a deep desire for justice. He was deeply motivated towards justice. He was provoked by injustice, even if it was like portion size in a restaurant. And I respected that about him. I respected the fact that he wasn't going to tolerate injustice. But his inability to work with that and to even forgive a slightly less portion size was ruining his life.
You had mentioned something at the previous session about distinguishing between forgiveness and reconciliation.
Oh yeah, right.
And I think that's an important. I want you to talk about that a little bit more, and also about the health benefits of forgiveness, because I'm thinking about the release that you have. I mean, of being able to, I don't know, I mean, whether or not you can fully close something off, but to release something in yourself that you're no longer, that's no longer, there's not a lot of energy organized around that particular person and that particular event and health benefits. But I thought that was a helpful distinction that you made at the earlier session about forgiveness is distinct from reconciliation, that you don't have, it may be good not to be back in relationship.
Exactly, right.
For instance, in interpersonal harm, not to be back in that relationship.
Yeah.
And often they've been conflated.
Right.
That all this, the vision of what has to happen in forgiveness does involve a restoration of the relationship.
Right, that's one of the main things that comes up when I talk about this in communities or present is people tend to find it helpful to make that distinction that forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. So that I might process forgiveness, which I would define as moving past a demand for revenge or internal avoidance towards an offender. I think there's an active and a kind of a passive face of unforgiveness. And move towards an attitude of goodwill towards an offender. I hope they get help. I hope they go into recovery. I hope something happens in their life that moves them. But none of that requires that I have ongoing relationship with them. And many of the problems around kind of sloppy definitions of forgiveness, or the kind that can set victims up for further problems, are a conflating of the two. And that forgiveness means I let this person back into my life on the same terms. And from a lot of respects, social justice, psychological, systemic, I'm not interested in that kind of sloppy version of forgiveness. The great social justice movements that have employed forgiveness, right? Nonviolent protest. I'll come to the table, we can be face to face looking at these issues, but everything's not okay. There needs to be change here. So I think forgiveness is helpful if it's understood as distinct from reconciliation, and if it's a kind of a nonviolent protest that I'm not going to exact revenge, but we very well may have some things to hash out here. Or I may have to just move along my way, and for some people, it may not even be safe to come to the table and talk. It might be a forgiveness that's processed outside of any relationship. So I guess the other half of your question was the health benefit. I mean, anger or the activation in the face of threat psychologically has a functional value, I believe. There's a functional value to mobilizing fight or flight responses in the face of threat. There can be a functional use of anger. I think it's pretty clear from the social science data and the health data that chronic anger is deleterious to the human organism. Chronic cross-situational anger or chronic dissociation. And some people's issues around forgiveness are not as much they're going around yelling at people in restaurants. They're in a kind of a trauma-based dissociative fog, which some people might call forgiveness, but they're not really tuned in, connecting. And there's a place for dissociate, there's an adaptive place for but as chronic coping strategies, they're limited. Especially they're limited in forming ongoing relationships that are healthy and constructive. So this is where it shows up sometimes, that people's stuff hasn't quite been worked through.
One of the issues that came up in the previous session is thinking about when harm is done within communities. So a lot of the people were interested, work in congregations or in communities in which harm has happened, and so we're not talking interpersonal. We're talking how do you think about a communal context in which persons may need to stay in some form of relationship just by being members of the same community, and how let's just say religious communities can participate in kind of silencing or how they participate in that process. I think a lot of the people that we were talking to are thinking in that way about how they haven't just been individually harmed, but then there's a whole communal dynamic
systemic trauma
that goes along with that, and how do we think about then the operation of theologies within those contexts? Because a lot of, for whose sake is forgiveness happening, right? When you think about, well, we just want communal peace, or we want this incident to go away, and how much that can really participate in not a process of healing, but in a process of kind of further silence.
And that's kind of what I mean by a dissociative form of forgiveness, sort of a forgiveness that's, let's put a smiley face on, and let's move past this in ways that don't necessarily take a look at what happened, how did it happen, what do we need to learn from this, what justice needs to be done. It's bypassing a number of things. Psychologists anymore kind of will tend to use terms like pseudo-forgiveness, bypass forgiveness, dissociative forgiveness. I think we should let others into the conversation at this point.
Yeah, as we do that, I wondered, I'm trying to imagine being around the table as I am listening to you, and what helps facilitate the move to the questions. So I would ask each of you, from the dialogue and from your individual work, what questions do you hear embedded in this that might potentially be live for people when they come from places that aren't the study of trauma or the study of forgiveness? In other words, it strikes me that there's an intersection in so many different ways. I think about methodological questions. Who's asking certain questions and in what ways, and do you correct the way you ask questions by your intersection with somebody in another field, say English literature, or so what helps others enter into the conversation so as to make use of the conversation that you're having. So if you could imagine being around the table before I turn to people.
I'd like to note something just obvious. It's different to have an interdisciplinary conversation with a real person of another discipline, which is a relational process, than to simply myself try to incorporate, you know, authors from another. And I think that's really interesting stuff methodologically, where I get to know you, your story, why you're interested in certain things, as well as all the expertise. But the relational process of that, I think, is really interesting.
I mean, this may be something that I learned from one of my teachers, Wendy Farley, and it may be the influence of phenomenology. There's a phenomenon that we're interested in getting at, and I want to I want every angle on that phenomenon. So that means if trauma is the phenomenon, I want everybody in on trying to figure out what that phenomenon is. And that will mean I'm an interloper in a lot of conversations that aren't my main conversation. So when I hear Mindy talking about post-colonialism, I'm like, it's infused with trauma. So it tells me something. It's an angle. Or when I hear mission studies, there's a whole intercultural translation questions that are like, what does it mean to be constantly misunderstood in a language, or always kind of not quite getting at something? So for me, it just seems like I approach this phenomenon with, of course, I bring the questions of systematic theology, but that was when I was at Yale, and then I went to Emory, and it wasn't just systematic theology anymore. It was like it broadened. And so I feel like if whoever wants to talk about that phenomenon, I want the best that you can bring to it, which makes it non-threatening to my discipline. In fact, I see theology as really the best, as interloping all the time, because we're about the questions. So that also says something about, it's like the questions of existence, theologians are in there. In a way, we still ask these big questions about, like, why are things as they are? Why are human beings so susceptible to harm? Like, wow, why is that? And is there a divine presence or absence that affects all of that? Like, who asks those kind of questions? So this is why I love being a theologian, because I'm like, I think philosophers ask those questions. I think, so it's more like whoever has something to say about that phenomenon, I'm like undiscriminating about where you come from. That does mean I don't choose necessarily attachment theory or the language of psychology as my primary language to have that conversation. And in fact, I probably, when I dip into these other fields too much, I'm very aware that that's not my primary language, but I need them. And I think this is central to the methodological questions around the table of the students, which is, I think theology, practical theology, systematic theology, constructive theology, historical theology, has always been about these big questions of existence. And I think we should be super proud of it. Like, we're in there on those questions. And so I think, Steve's work is, I'm interested in the empirical. I'm interested in what he said is the descriptive of what is. And theology, in certain modes, is super prescriptive. And so it does gesture about saying, what is human nature? It does gesture boldly into the prescriptive, and it gets in serious trouble for making a lot of prescriptive claims about reality. But I worry about ceding all those prescriptive claims too, and just merely doing the descriptive. People are saying that they're suffering in this way, and therefore we've got to take the data of what they say about what they're suffering. No, I want to get at the problem of suffering, and that means that I move between the descriptive and the prescriptive, so that I'm not like in the sky about the problem of suffering, but I'm looking at the empirical data too. and yet kind of boldly saying, I want to talk about evil and in its somewhat scary prescriptive modes.
That's a shared assumption, I feel, because I definitely think we need the prescriptive and the descriptive, and sometimes social science has embedded assumptions about what the good is or what is ultimate. Browning's phrase, metaphors of ultimacy, that aren't admitted. And so I think that the interdisciplinary dialogue can help those of us who are primarily social scientists sort of get more conversant, more aware, more honest.
So you're both about the project of interrogating. You want to include interrogating people as well as texts. You want to find out what is said, but also what is not said. There was this old TV show years ago. It's not what you say that counts, it's what you don't say. But how is it that you guide your interrogations? And are there key languages, and what does it mean when the languages don't necessarily fit together, or the assumptions of the approaches don't fit together? But why don't we open it up to questions, whether it's questions about the particulars about forgiveness and trauma, or questions that start to arise when you think about bringing together different languages or different questions or different assumptions, different angles to interrogate phenomena, bring together interrogating living human documents as well as documents. I know you have a question.
Well, it's not a question exactly. It's just part entering the conversation. As a historian, I'm listening to this and listening to you all describe the big questions that come. And of course, then the issue of the particular context comes up for me. And I'll give a specific example. I'm part of a dissertation defense tomorrow about Nazarene missionaries in Swaziland. And missionaries felt empathy for the trauma of leprosy. I'm going to put it in your framework. So they found lepers that they then put into a leper colony. And one of the questions being asked in that is, why do people put themselves in positions of structured inferiority? In other words, post-colonial studies, you see the lepers agreed to accept the definition of themselves as traumatized, even though in their own culture it wasn't really seen as a trauma. But they benefited so much from being in a position of structured inferiority, you could put it that way, in relation to the colonialist missionaries, that they were angry when that situation ended because they lost their privileges that they had by being victims.
Right.
Okay, so I hear this, the issue is not forgiveness, it's not even real trauma. They were happy living there, they had leprosy, but they made a lot of money on the side growing marijuana and stuff like that. That's what makes this an interesting case study.
Wow.
And selling it from within the leprosy colony, and But it's a context in which the languages of trauma and forgiveness are, the historical context changes the whole thing. So that's what I was thinking of. I was putting your two comments in dialogue with this specific situation. So I just want to mirror that back and say, how do you accommodate your big questions to these local factors where the actors themselves don't necessarily see it the way you do? How do you work with that methodologically?
Well, in my discipline, it is doing research in different cultural contexts. So, for example, back in the early 2000s, I started collaborating with Hmong leaders in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area of Southeast Asian group that you may or may not be familiar with, but came following the Vietnam War to the United States and started collaborating with some leaders. And I had one Hmong anthropologist who told me quickly when I was talking about some of my interests, and he said, Hmong people are not forgiving, which I thought was quite a generalization to offer. But he went on to explain, we're a warrior people that was kicked out of China, we were kicked out of Vietnam. We fought as a tribe, nomadic tribe throughout time, forgiveness is not our highest virtue. Loyalty is, and the willingness to fight. However, as we talked further and got other people involved, this is just one example, but a research project emerged of trying to look at what are the dynamics and understandings and perspectives on forgiveness in Hmong communities. So we did a couple studies that way, which were just fascinating, and really challenged a lot of, as you would expect, a lot of the main ideas about the psychology of forgiveness in American literature. There was stuff that came up that was so radically different than anything you would find in American psychology of forgiveness or the measures used. And so that kind of ethnographic qualitative research problematizes the dominant theories that are emerging, and also, of course, sets us onto new questions that couldn't be thought of unless we got into that context and the particularities of how they come at that. I mean, as one little example, we did it at a Hmong therapist I knew who did an interview study, and pretty much every Hmong person he interviewed who had experiences of forgiveness they wanted to talk about, when it got to asking them how they forgave, they didn't cite sort of intrapsychic dynamics, I empathized, or they would quote a cultural proverb, like their answer would literally be, like my father always said, my brother and I will prepare each other's funerals. That was their answer. Or like my mother always said, we always end up sleeping in the same bed at night. Almost everyone cited a proverb, which was just a fascinating thing that I never would have thought about had I not gotten involved in that.
Well, I would think the ethnography would push back at this idea. If you're looking for what's not there, there's a kind of arrogance in that if people present themselves a different way.
Yeah.
And one big question we have in history is, when can you read something into something, or when are you obligated to say they say or act this way, and they say this is what it means to them, therefore that's what it means to them.
Yeah. I wanted just to add a little bit, because it helps us to think about where the kind of source of our studies comes from. And one of the things that I always mention or talk extensively about in the trauma course is that trauma studies arose as a white Western European study of suffering, right? The context in which the study itself arose also tells us something about the limitations of, or its limitations, but also its need for expansion. So there's really interesting stuff going on in trauma studies that's well, I want to say one thing about the medical model. That the exporting of a medical model of trauma to other cultures has been severely critiqued and is problematic. What does it mean to take Western models of kind of healing health to transport it, export it to other parts of the world, and the assumptions about a lot of the kind of indigenous practices of healing, what is a good life, these things are just trampled over by a kind of Western medical model. And trauma studies brings that history with it too, a kind of diagnostic model. But I think the interdisciplinary study of trauma is pretty exciting in that people are raising these questions from medical anthropology. People like Arthur Kleinman, Paul Farmer, are raising questions about trauma that talk about the kind of thick cultural dimensions. Veena Das is somebody also who does a lot of work on trauma, and the question of whether trauma is a term, whether we're exporting that term itself when other people would say it's something else. That can be questioned. I think what's interesting about the case that you raised is to think about cycles of history and occupation, land and cultures in which there's asymmetries of power, and whether even assessing something as a good thing, like they saw it as a good thing. My thing is, who are they telling that it's a good thing? Like, who's receiving that back about we're happier this way or we're better this way? Even the reception assumes that it's coming back to, in many cases, people who have who hold power. So I don't know. I mean, the mission in colonial history, this is how people interpret their cultures and under what context, that it's just so layered and complicated. But I think acknowledging the limits of our disciplines in terms of its initial scope, to say trauma studies grew out of something, and some problematic things about Freud, about Charcot, bringing French prostitutes in for study, and all these men of science are looking at these hysterical women diagnosing symptoms. That's like the birth of trauma studies, if you really think about where did it start. Problematic gender, the hysterical woman is specimen in front of a bunch of men of science. That's problematic from its very origins in terms of the study. But I think there's lots of interesting things happening, and a lot of people from different cultures taking up the questions of trauma, and they're going to be differently inflected.
If I could make a brief comment. I don't want to redeem Freud, but there's an interesting parallel in Freud's study, and he talks about what he calls epinosic gain. He tells a story of somebody breaking a leg, somebody who's a loner breaking a leg, and by virtue of breaking a leg, he has a cast put on. And becomes very social, and his social life explodes. And when his leg heals, he decides to leave the cast on because it equips him to have something. And so he sustains his disability because it enhances something else. So there may be something universal, not only across individuals, but communities, where there's always a trade-off among different motives, and there are certain things that we have to sacrifice in achieving something else. So it's an idea that as much as there are theories that are limited by virtue of culture and context, there may be certain universals that start to show themselves through the theories, just as long.
Interesting.
Questions that we still have a few more minutes that come up for others?
I don't know if it's a question, but it's something that came to mind as the conversation was going on. Someone who speaks Greek at home, I was thinking about the term, what I would say when I was asking for forgiveness in Greek, and it's sikhoro, or sikhoriseme, like forgive me. And part of that is there's a sense in which, etymologically speaking, it's making space for the other person, or letting someone get under your skin. A lot of trauma is not being able to reconcile, obviously, what's happening. And theologically speaking, I tend to orient myself towards an understanding of a relational ontology. We are a culmination of the multiplicity of our relations. That's what constitutes our person. And so trauma would be not allowing that person who's already in you, or fighting against that person's presence in you. So to let someone else under your skin would be to come to terms with the fact that they are part of your story. And then forgiving them doesn't mean welcoming them or maintaining a relationship, but acknowledging the fact that they are in a relationship. They just don't have to be physically present necessarily in the relationship, but they are present in you because they're under your skin.
So does it literally mean under your skin? Does it have that etymological connection?
It gets that sense. It's almost that does have a sense of like getting underground or welcoming underground, so to speak. It's not skin. It's like it comes from a similar etymological root as like ground or earth or something.
So the sense is that you're already a part of me. So I need to kind of make space.
At least that's what I was thinking, and I'm interpreting it in that way with reference to my theological basis, which is that ontology is relational.
That's very much how I think about the process that may culminate in forgiveness psychologically, that it doesn't start with necessarily trying to forgive somebody. and you're talking about seeking forgiveness in a way
Or asking.
it actually probably best starts with what you described of coming to terms, coming to awareness, dealing with the impact.
Mm-hmm.
And in the cases of forgiveness, it's going to be, if I'm considering forgiving someone, it's probably best starting out with surveying the damage and coming to terms with the relational impact.
Accepting this part of your story too.
Not having it a split off, dissociated thing, but not dealing with. And sometimes that's why I think forgiveness work can be like grief work, really. Because it's processing the sadness, the disappointment, a range of emotions that don't immediately, take the form of forgiveness.
I think one of the theologically fascinating things that connects to what you were saying is there is an understanding in trauma of say the phenomenon that I was talking about at the beginning of the transmission of histories that we aren't aware of, that you do have a sense of a kind of permeability between, there's not such a division between people, that in fact we're taking in people and they are us.
Yes.
And there's not an ability to do that kind of separation. I mean, it's narrated in trauma studies kind of negatively and problematically, like the kind of interconnectedness means that we are more vulnerable to being harmed because, in fact, we can't quite make those divisions. And I think that's really theologically rich. I hope that I think it's leading me in my research to talk much more than I would ever have about a kind of collective body. And I'm using the image of skin, so that's why I'm interested in your kind of getting under your skin.
It's not etymologically under skin, but it's making space for a welcoming, and it has like the second part, the sig is obviously together, but the second part, the horeo, is there is a connotation of something to do with earth and digging. So
Well, and the idea that you're welcoming something that's already in you, or part of you.
At least relationally speaking, so theologically speaking, but the word, the sikoro, it's not that.
But I like the possibility of connection.
There's a positive cast on some of this. Stephen Hausman used to teach at Harvard in cognitive neuroscience. He came up with the term social prosthetic devices. And what he says is if you develop intimate relationships with people, part of what you do is you start in your relationship to work on things that they need to work on behalf of them. Like my wife would come home and she'd say, can you remind me of that, or would you help me think about that? And so you start thinking about it. And what he says is you're not only doing this cognitively, your brain is so plastic. Your brain rewires to accommodate and adjust to taking in to work on things as if you were the other, but they are now a part of you. So truly, there's what's called the integumentive theory of person, where you end at your skin. And in point of fact, you don't, because your brain is rewiring to work on things in conjunction with others who are not within this boundary. The boundary is a false boundary.
I was thinking as you talked, and it was so interesting to hear you in conversation. Think about all the different disciplinary partners that we have in practical theology and how those disciplinary partners themselves are interdisciplinary. So trauma studies is an interdisciplinary field, spirituality studies is an interdisciplinary field. So you've got these multiple networks of interdisciplinary study and conversation kind of coming together. But I'm trying to sort of tease out, like I heard you talk about the descriptive and the prescriptive, and trying to figure out sort of the limitations of your own discipline. So psychology not giving you the tools maybe or the go ahead to get to the prescriptive.
Right, that's how I would put it,
And I'm wondering, Shelley, if systematics hasn't quite gotten to the descriptive in the way that you want to get to the descriptive, just sort of figuring out practical theology is still having a debate about this too, because we've gone so heavily to the descriptive that people are actually raising the question of what about maybe normative might be the word we use more than prescriptive, but what's the normative theological component of practical theology? How do we avoid making it just a social science? But I'm just sort of wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what what do you find maybe as sort of the limits or the edges of the field in which you're sort of see yourself primarily located and what you're reaching? It sounds like you're reaching for I mean, even this conversation models something that you're kind of moving toward in your scholarship.
I think
and I see it as perfectly located in practical theology, but I'm wondering how you, like, what does the conversation raise in terms of that?
Can I respond real quick?
Sure, that makes sense.
I've thought most of my career that I'm trying to do the integration of psychology and theology. That's how I've thought about what I'm trying to do. I think that could potentially fit under the heading of practical theology, but although I guess I've always personally liked the tension points of two different disciplines in some ways, and it maps onto that prescriptive, descriptive, and I think the tensions, the points where they don't totally integrate are really useful. But I would say what I'm trying to go after is not a merger where they, it's total oneness, but a differentiated kind of integration, which I sometimes use the metaphor of trying to put together a good meal, which kind of goes together, and it's different than in the Midwest. We have this old country buffet where you can go there and get ham and lasagna and taco,
rice pudding,
yeah,
always rice pudding.
But it's fun to do once in a while. But most people wouldn't, call that a great meal. And then also the thing I like about that metaphor is that you could have different great meals. People could draw theology and psychology as just two and integrate, and they could select from different theological traditions or different, psychology, and the meal would look differently, but it might still be relatively coherent, cohesive, pragmatically has a positive impact.
A different metaphor could be marriage counseling.
Yeah, right.
Because you have two separate partners,
Yes.
but how do they coexist constructively?
Yeah.
No wonder you were interested in premarital.
It's the same stuff. Doing couples therapy is the same stuff I'm talking about.
How do I answer that? So I would identify as a constructive theologian. So in many ways, leaving some of the systematic framework, I think because of the kind of questions that I wanted to pursue, that it was more than just developing a Christology. What's interesting about constructive theology is it often ends up being deconstructive theology. So a lot of people who work in constructive theology are interested in critical theories, are interested in the kind of the analysis of power, the analysis of empire, and it can, like, we're really good at diagnosing what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And nervous about heavy normative claims. So we're in this kind of strange position where in fact we have the great critical analysis to diagnose what's wrong, but a reticence about making great universal claims that many of us ran away from because we're nervous about the fact that they don't speak for all of humanity here.
Right.
So I think that there's a kind of growing group of constructive theologians who actually want to be a little more bolder in our constructive claims, trusting that our analysis, that we're not going to trample on people given the analysis that we've done.
Right.
And I get nervous, I think, increasingly when I'm reading doctoral dissertations and there's not a deep or heavy theological engagement. And I think because I think often we model, and maybe I don't know, we model a reticence about, I should say myself, a reticence about, we're super qualified about all the things. Well, we don't want to speak for all peoples. And so then we we end up making a lot of qualifications and fall back often on the descriptive. So I think it's a real area that we need to think about very strongly here about what our dissertations start looking like, because I think there can be more robust theological assertions without scaring people in the religion department to think that we're just doing apologetics. And I think maybe some more conversation about that would be really helpful, is to say, I don't know if it's called normative, but it sure is envisioning. I mean, I would call it, I'm always about healing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always about, like, is what I'm offering going to be healing? And that's and that keeps me really, rather than just saying, oh, well, look how terrible things are.
Here's the wrinkle from an empirical perspective too, or as a psychologist. If we have some empirical data that something is helpful, we can problematize that, we can deconstruct it and all that. But in my discipline, we're going to have to do something today, and we need some data that supports it. And if it integrates well with some sort of theological framework, we may have to go with that because we got people dying around here, and
Right. You can't wait around for us constructive theologians to.
We better go with it if we come together.
Yeah, and often the kind of nuance or the textured theological work isn't so easy to pick up and just kind of do that integration with it. So it's interesting for me to hear that as, maybe thinking more about our interdisciplinary partners, what we can offer them to use without all the qualifications. It's helpful.
We're about at the end of our time, a little bit past it, so Chris had to slip out for a doctor's appointment, but thank you both so much.
Yeah, this was very fun.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
being part of this.
It's great to have it taped too. Thanks for